Hello, Ramesh. Thank you so much for joining the personal branding series that I run on my blog. We've known each other for many years. In fact, you've seen me grow up as a kid in Calcutta. So I've been following your work, very fascinated by how you have, built your brand over time. So just wanted to, take the opportunity to thank you for joining this series and wanted to, if you could kindly introduce yourself to our viewers, they get a background on what you have done and where you are currently.
Thank you for the invitation, Anishu. Yeah, it's been a long, long time. By way of introduction, I think the easiest way uh, to put some label to me, since it's a personal branding session that we're having, is I think we are the pioneers in the brand valuation space. We were the people who actually introduced the subject to India and made it a strategic application for Indian industry. This is now, 18 years down the road. That's the easiest one-line strap.
You're being very modest, Ramesh. Okay,
Well,
so
interest of time.
so in terms of what's your understanding? What according to you is personal branding, and how do you define it?
See, at its most basic, it's the idea of carving out and appropriating a
Hmm.
niche for yourself in terms of personal or professional traits or both.
Hmm.
So he is the most generous person in the neighborhood.
Hmm.
Okay. And people will say, yeah, that makes sense. He is actually, his traits are like that. Or you might say, she is the most skilled writer in the firm.
Hmm.
So there's an appropriation of professional traits in the second level. This is
Got
at
it.
its most basic.
Hmm.
And see, even though we may not have applied science to it over the centuries, people typically have some level of personal branding. Because if you ask 30, 40 people about who is Anishu,
Hmm.
uh, you may get different words, but give or take, those
Hmm.
40 people will come back to the same two or three traits,
Right.
which basically means without having thought too scientifically about it, you have sent out signals in terms of experience, in terms of behavior, as well as, let me say, expression that has totaled up and accumulated to those two or three traits consistently.
Hmm.
And therefore, you have, in some sense, appropriated it. Okay. Some people do it more professionally. That's the next level.
Hmm.
And people like you will help them out. The other is at the third level. Uh, the question also is to what extent can you monetize it,
Hmm.
right? And some people have done a very very smart job of building it and monetizing it. But we'll
Hmm.
come to that as we go down. Yeah.
Fantastic.
But at its basic, this is it.
Fantastic. So, I know you will not claim that you are a personal brand in your own right, but the fact that you are a pioneer in the brand valuation space, you have brought this to the market in India, and you've been speaking about this in various forums. So, what are some of the signs which tell you that you're making progress in your journey as a personal brand?
Well, I won't be overly humble or anything like that. But the uh, fact of the matter, if you remove all the bells and whistles, is that since we introduced this to India,
Mm,
since it was a completely new notion,
mm,
and since it started getting used and let me say leveraged quite a bit,
mm.
we got associated with it because we were the people who introduced it. So
Right.
to that extent, yes, the signs are pretty clear. So if you put my name on a Google, or
Mm,
if you put my firm's name on the Google, you
mm,
will immediately get these words getting quite easily associated with the term brand valuation.
right.
Uh, so to that extent, yes, there has been a very sharp appropriation, even
Mm,
if not global or India wide, or it hasn't become a household name. But
mm,
amongst people who matter and in the community, there is a
mm,
fairly close and specific association with this skill with us. So to that extent, we appropriated that. And
mm,
because I personally was involved in bringing it in,
mm.
the personality aspect of brand valuation is also to some extent stuck with me.
Got it. So, in your head, I mean, how when you were going about your journey in your career, what are some of those steps? Were there some purposeful steps that you took to build or curate your brand?
Okay. So there are two ways at which you come at this. One is that you find an interesting space, right?
Mm,
And then you want to carve out a place for yourself in that space.
mm,
So you want to be a successful cricketer or a movie star, you start doing all the right things. You put yourself in page 3, you get seen at the right parties, etc., because you want to carve yourself in what you see as an attractive space. For me, it was not like that. It was a bit of a bizarre idea at the point of time that brands could have value, right? So brand was one thing which was very right brain and, very communication and very logo and identity and stuff. I said, no, that's not really the entire truth, although those may be parts of it. There's a very linear left brain business aspect to it, which we must consider because it's a reality. Okay? And so it was a bit bizarre for people, except that that's how I started because I felt strongly about it. It's not that it seems an attractive space to carve out like, the budding movie star I spoke about. Okay? It was something which is the truth which has not been revealed. And therefore I said, okay, let me talk about it. It may take 15 years, and it has, to establish it as a let me say, useful skill and as a practice. But so what? Because I still believe in it strongly. I mean, Dr. King took a long time to establish, equal rights, the civil rights for the people in America, the disenfranchised. He did it in a very different way because he followed Gandhi, and he said, I don't want it the violent way. So he did it in his own way, but because he believed in it. So you can approach it in two ways. One, through a strong belief in which you build a space, or through carving out a space for yourself in a larger space which is already occupied and which is popular. So it's a two way to do it.
Fantastic. So what I hear is you're saying you need to take a stand, or rather have a space which you need to carve out, and the second is be persistent and do it over time and establish that. Is that so? If I were to ask you, if people were to relate, what is your personal brand, or what are those traits which come to their mind when they think about Ramesh Thomas?
I think it will be linearity. I think it will be logic. It will be tenacity, because I don't like to let go, and it will be about material results.
Got it. Okay. And so if I were to ask you, what if you were to look around you, who are a couple of names that come to your mind in terms of personal brands, and what are some of the characteristics that strike you about them?
The very obvious ones, if you look at India, for example, if you're talking to an Indian audience, one is Amitabh Bachchan. Okay. And why do I say this? Because while he is a successful movie star and has been a movie star, and I'm using both those words quite responsibly, I think he sits far above the category. Right? Because he demonstrates traits which are not of the category. For example, it is never known that he comes late for a shoot or for a meeting. Okay. It's never known that he speaks, brazenly about himself. He's extremely, how do I say, understated. Okay. He is extremely disciplined, right? He treats other people with respect. So he has built some traits which sit above the category, although at some level, the platform which he has used is a space of filmdom in India. Okay. This is one. You take somebody like Tendulkar, for example. I think all the traits are obvious. But again, for better or for worse, he sits above the category, and therefore the brand is personal, albeit you think of him as a cricketer, right? Federer is somebody who has demonstrated traits which are again very different from just the category of being a great tennis player, right? As a sports person, as a sporting person, as a human, as a caring human, he has demonstrated far more. So he leaves the sport behind quite a bit. And the last one, which of course is very interesting to me personally, is someone like Dr. Devi Shetty. Again, a successful heart surgeon, probably the most successful in the country today, may not be the most commercially successful. Again, it sits way above the category. He genuinely cares about the progress of healthcare in India and where it can go, where India can go with its health capabilities. He'll always taking cudgels of the government. He's always putting himself out because of that. He's always making contrary statements. He doesn't want to be seen, right? And therefore, all of these people, while extremely well known in a category, right, far above that, and that's what makes them personal brands.
Brilliant. So, while you went about your journey of becoming a brand valuation expert, obviously there were challenges. People obviously were not aware of this particular term, and you had to. So, what are some of those challenges which you faced, and what are some of the techniques you used to overcome them, persuade people?
Okay, that's interesting. See, when you take a journey like mine, right, or like Dr. King, for example, these are difficult journeys because it's contrary to the prevailing narrative. So when you say blacks must have rights or brands must have value, the first thing is, hey, what are you talking about? Right? It makes sense. Okay. I'm talking about in the 60s, not now.
Right.
Now we have done everything else. But in the 60s, when you ask the question, but they were slaves. What do you mean rights for them? Okay. So similarly in 2000, when, people like us came up and said brands have value, what do you mean by that? Okay. How do you do that? And the accountants also started laughing, The point is, when you start a journey like that, the biggest challenge is there is no such narrative available. So establishing the narrative itself becomes the platform on which you can create a personal brand. And believe me, Anishu, you asked the question about personal branding, but at that point of time, the idea was not personal branding.
Right.
Yeah. The idea was to say this ideology, this thinking is critical to India. If nobody else is doing it, I want to do it. See, the focus was not on personal branding. The byproduct was that people started associating me and of course later the company with it.
Right.
First thing, the narrative. So it's a complete counter narrative. It is a bad thing and a good thing, because once people start saying, oh, that's the guy who talks, that mad guy who talks about brand value, is it? Acha, what he has to say. Okay. So then what happens is newspapers start talking to you and say, what is this all about? Correct? Is there anybody who has done it? Have you done it for anybody? Okay. Then academic institutions, MBA programs, saying, brand value, okay, that sounds interesting. Can you come and spend an hour and a half with our students with it? Is there a course you can create? So I actually created courses for 2 or 3 institutes in the country, right? Like MICA, like ASCII, spoke about it at many places. So what happens is, at least because it's a curiosity, people are saying, what the hell is he talking about? And he's keeping on talking about it. So let's listen to the guy. So that's how it started getting built. Thereafter, the last part is, can they then apply it and leverage it for their own work? Whether it's an institute saying, okay, here is a very new kind of a course that we can do, or a company which says, can we actually do something with our brand which demonstrate value to the shareholders? That's the last. And when that happens, then it's magic, because something contrarian has become a narrative, has got reached, and has got monetized. I'd be very happy if institutes can charge a little more because of the course that we do. I'd be very happy if shares go up tremendously, and we have seen that as a consequence of the work that we do. So that's when it really becomes magic. Otherwise, it remains an interesting narrative which people keep speaking about. It seems contrarian, and therefore, when it is spoken, it sounds great. But when the noise dies down, there's nothing left.
Got it. So related to that, Ramesh, so one of the things which the organizations always say, that employees are the biggest assets, and we need to value the human resources side of things. But they also forget that employees are personal brands in their own right. So is there a way in which organizations can think of valuation from that context and personal branding becoming valued?
Okay, so the first and most important thing is you have to understand the import of that statement, the question which you asked. And there are 2 or 3 areas in which this becomes quite sharp. So, for example, if you take the large consultancies, right? It's a people's business. And therefore, when a good consultant leaves, who has a good relationship with those, with his clients, right? His personal brand actually is going to be dangerous to retaining that brand, that business, for his consultancy which he's leaving, right?
Absolutely.
You see that with advertising agencies. How many advertising agencies have sprouted up as a consequence of strong personal brands going away and starting their own business? Right?
Absolutely.
Even if you take a Devi Shetty, for example, or Naresh Trehan, the 2 big names that we know in the cardiac care in this country. So actually, when he was in Manipal, when he started Manipal Heart Foundation, Manipal Heart Foundation was equal to Devi Shetty. Escorts was almost entirely equal to Dr. Naresh Trehan, right? So when they left, it was very easy for them to start up new stuff, because capital providers are willing to put money into their personal brand, not as ex-employee of Manipal or something like that. They have built very strong brands for themselves, right? So this is true. The employees sometimes are very, very strong personal brands, even while existing and continuing to work in their organizations. So they are the stars, right?
Absolutely.
Not you call them stars.
Great point. So now there are a lot of people who want advice on how to start from scratch. How do you build a brand? Or there are people who have spent many years in the industry and they feel that they haven't really got there. So, what's your advice for anyone starting from scratch, thinking about their personal brand? What must they start thinking?
So let's take a couple of examples that we have worked with, right, to make the point. So many years ago, I think it was about 10 years ago, a gentleman called Tejas Patel came to us. He's a doctor, and he was a very well known, and he used to do angioplasty.
Okay.
And he used to practice out of Ahmedabad. Okay. Now, it was a very strange request. Through his chartered accountant, he reached out to my colleague in Bombay, right? Said that, we want to do a brand valuation for the doctor.
For the doctor? Okay.
For the doctor, for himself.
Got it.
And we said, okay, fine. He said, no, don't worry about it. It seemed like a bizarre request, so my colleague himself was a little bit surprised. And so the chartered accountant said, don't worry, we'll fly you down and everything. But we just need you to have a conversation with the doctor because he's a really busy man and to figure out whether this can be done. Okay. Now, I won't take any further names, but to cut a long story short, both of us landed up there in Ahmedabad. And we asked a very simple question. So why do you want to do this? He says, no, I want to know whether I have value. And the guy pulled out Sony Bio. This is a cardiac specialist. Okay. He pulled out a Sony Bio and he showed us like a tableau, like a plateau. He says, see, this is where I joined the hospital and this is where I left.
Okay.
Revenues and volumes, you could actually clearly has plotted the number of patients he has treated.
Wow.
The number of by the amount of money he had charged per patient. Okay.
Okay.
So is this not brand value? I mean, I almost just hands feet. I said I thought I knew the subject. So to cut a long story short, we did a valuation for him because we knew that he knew what he was talking about, what he wanted. Right. And why? Because he was having a fairly difficult time in terms of his commercial relationship with the hospital. So the hospital said that, they are giving him patients. He was saying the entire practice exists because of two things. One, his reputation and his capability. These are the two intangible assets that he brings to the table. So we structured a document for him and a defense so that he would have a meaningful commercial conversation with his hospital and have a fair share of the earnings, establishing that his brand value is really what runs that practice of angioplasty. Okay. And he found that he had many firsts to his name. For example, he was the person who pioneered the idea of radial angioplasty in India, right? Okay. Basically, angioplasty used to be done through the femur at that point of time. And it's right up. Okay. And it would take about 5 to 6 days to get out. This was like 24 hours. Okay. He brought it to the country. Okay. So he was a pioneer. He knew what he was doing. His brand was built. People believed in him, etc. So brand valuation helped him to have another conversation. Okay. So my advice to people is, if you really want to do this, there are three important things to this. One, please be very clear what is it that you want to own, the space that you want to own. Okay. Right. Two, what traits will differentiate you in that space that you want to own? What can people associate with you? Right. And three, most importantly, this is 60% of the issue. The people that you want to establish your brand with, right? What specific ways they leverage who you are? Because the leverage part is not there. It's about having a nice fancy story which you put out, which is not relevant to anybody. Okay. Yeah, so the two old pillars of differentiation and relevance both must be put into place very quickly, right? And then you must work actively towards underscoring or sentence you speak, right? Or activity of yours that must be nailed down further and further. It must be reiterated. And once you do that with a focus, you have a brand. Now, will that be brand built amongst 10 people or 10,000 or 10 million people? It doesn't matter. But the clarity, appropriation and leverage is what matters.
Absolutely. So again, recently I read that there are, these celebrities out there who are ensuring various parts of their anatomy and various parts of their, their physical appearances, like a voice and, tongue and hair and all that. So, but that's one part of who they are. I mean, does that add value to their personal brand in any sense?
See, human beings have difficulty in grasping something which is not material. Okay. So the fact that J. Lo was an entertainer, right, is the big one. Okay.
Right.
But the problem is the material aspect that they associated with her was her buttocks. And I think she used it quite cleverly. Therefore, her buttocks was insured for $300 million+. Okay. Cristiano Ronaldo is a fabulous sports person, one of the most well-known, most enjoyable to watch in history. But again, the material, let me say, what do you call it? Definition of him was a fact, and since he was a footballer, the most important aspect was his legs. So they insured his legs for a hell of a lot of money. I can't recall how much it was. But then, it's a reductionism of the worst kind. It comes down to a buttocks or a pair of legs or a pair of lips. It's not the whole picture. Right?
Exactly.
But I'm saying, what do they insure? The insurers also want something material to insure, right? So this is visible.
Got it. Okay. And, so now with the pandemic happening, COVID-19, and there are crises happening across the world, how should personal brands look at their actions and how should they conduct themselves differently or normally?
Quite easy. I was just having a conversation with a young person today. She's a millennial. And one of your questions was about millennials.
Yes.
See, life has been very easy for people for many years. Okay. So I keep referring back and the conversation was really about that forward, which is doing the rounds, about how Sound of Silence came about as a famous song, right?
Right.
And there is this piece, there is a story about how this blind person who was Art Garfunkel's friend actually was an inspiration for that song. So she was asking me, have people been so kind these days? Also, do you see people being so kind? See, I said, COVID is a good example because after the Second World War, after you lost 75 million people, right, and almost 2/3 of the Jewish community was wiped out. Okay, human beings came together in a manner which we had never seen before in history, at least our recorded history. The whole world came together, and the consequence of that, was great brands, great art, great music, great business models, all sorts of interesting things came out. Okay. So in a crisis like this, when people are coming together, that connectivity in any case is going to become natural. How do you put yourself out in a heightened connectivity which you can see today? We're all talking to each other. We're all caring for each other. We're all wondering whether our friend is well. We are all like, is your mother who's 80? Is she okay or not? These are concerns that we have and we share with each other. In that heightened connectedness, how can you establish who you are very quickly? And that's the best way in which you can use COVID.
Got it. Brilliant. And, so as we wrap up, just wanted to ask you, what is your recipe or mantra in one line for personal branding success? How would you define that?
Stay highly focused and stay highly relevant. So empathy is very important. In that empathy, if you know your role, you will naturally and automatically become a very powerful personal brand. As I said, I can't guarantee whether it'll be about 10 people, 10,000 people, or 10 million people. But if you stay focused and you stay relevant, you will definitely make it.
Fantastic. This has been brilliant, Ramesh. Thank you so much for taking the time to share these insights. Very, very valuable. And I'm sure the viewers will really love this.
It's a privilege. Thank you, Anish.